All right, and we are live. Hey, welcome to Talkin Doctrine, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight we have an awesome broadcast. We're going to be talking about is Calvinism or Reformed Theology would be better. Is that correct? But Calvinism correct just went better for the title. So if you guys have been watching Talkin Doctrine for some time, I think you go back to the 4th episode. Is when Chris joined us for the first time, and when we were talking about hell and God's eternal punishment, talking about the difference between eternal torment and conditional immortality. Because we all know, or not we all know, but you would know from there that Chris has a channel, I believe a website too, called ReThinking Hell. So we have come together and tried to explain to others and actually had discussions with people who disagreed with us what conditional immortality is. And we've always been on the same side of the argument. And it's been great. Chris and I are actually good friends, and I really enjoy all the times that he's joined us. But this time we're going to try something different. We're actually on two different sides. Because on this topic, is Calvinism correct? Chris, and I did mistype his name in the title before. If you guys, if any of you guys saw that, I do apologize. But Chris affirms to the Reformed theology, and I myself reject it or deny it, I guess would be the way to say it. But we never really talked about that because the topic at hand was always, conditional immortality. So tonight we're really just going to have a discussion about it. It's not a debate or two friends who care and love one another, and we're not trying to get in each other's face and say you're a heretic and I'm right and you're wrong. So having a discussion with somebody you disagree with that you also consider a friend is I think valuable, because we can actually go back and forth and just make sure everybody really understands from both sides of where we're coming from and why we see the things we do from Scripture. And so, Lord willing, this broadcast will benefit not just Chris and I, but everyone who views it as well. So I pray that you guys are all blessed. So what I'd like is for Chris not only to introduce himself and say hi to the people that know him from before, but I also want him to take some time and really give a concise but detailed summary of what Calvinism is. And maybe there might even be a few different points, divisions within Calvinism. I'm not exactly sure, but what I've learned from Chris is that he's very articulate. He explains things very well. And for a discussion on Calvinism, I wouldn't think that there would be a better one to join me. So, Chris, welcome, and thank you for joining me again. And I can't wait to have the discussion.
Thanks. The pleasure and honor is all mine.
So, yeah, if you don't mind, will you introduce yourself for everybody? Oh, I had you. I think I had it clicked on you as I was talking the whole time just then. But yeah, if you don't mind, introduce yourself for everybody.
Sure. My name is Chris Date, as you said, and as you've already pointed out, I am part of a ministry known as ReThinking Hell, which you can find at rethinkinghell.com, where we promote and defend the doctrine of conditional immortality in opposition to, or in contrast to, the more traditional, more dominant view of hell, of eternal conscious torment. But here today, I'm not really here as a representative of Rethinking Hell, because at Rethinking Hell and within the broader conditionalist community, we differ on how we answer the question of Calvinism. And so there are plenty of conditionalists who are not Calvinists and plenty who are, myself among them. So just wanted to make that clear. I'm not here representing Rethinking Hell, and just wanted to get that out of the way. I am also a Calvinist, what some people have called a high Calvinist or a 5-point Calvinist, which I'll explain in a moment. I was not always one as a believer. When I first became a believer about 18 years ago, when I was 20, 21 years old, I knew very little Christian doctrine. I was very unfamiliar with this debate within Christianity because I wasn't raised in a church home. I wasn't raised in a Christian family, at least not an overtly one. So when I entered into the church, especially in a country like America, which so prizes liberty and freedom, I just continued to assume what I'd already believed as an atheist, which is that we have what I would later come to realize has been called libertarian free will, which is the ability to choose one thing, but equally the ability to choose an alternative to that thing. And not long after I became a believer, I became best friends with a guy who continues to be my best friend to this day, and he was older in the faith than I was. And he, through his mentorship and discipleship, he introduced me to Calvinism, and I fought it tooth and nail because at the time my wife still wasn't a believer, and the thought that and I'll unpack this a little bit more as I explain what Calvinism is. The thought that she might not be predestined to believe as I had apparently been was something that it just angered me. I was furious at that prospect. What I eventually came to realize, though, is that I much rather would that decision be in God's perfect and righteous hands than in my wife's sinful and fallen hands. And that, combined with the fact that I couldn't refute the biblical evidence that my friend was presenting me with, I became convinced of Calvinism and have only since then gone on to be more convinced. And in fact, recently, I published a two views debate book with another author in which I defend certain aspects of Calvinism, and my opponent argues against it. And if your viewers want to check that out, they can go to amazon.com/author/Chris Date, and they'll see the 3 books I published, one of which is this two views debate book that I've been talking about.
Or they can, in the description already, you can copy and paste. I didn't want to get the outside link just because YouTube, but you can copy and paste the title of that book he's talking about, put it right in the Amazon search. It'll bring you right to it, and then click on his name and you can get right there. So copy and paste in the description, and it's pretty quick. I made sure it was easy to do.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. So the last couple things I'll say about myself: I've been married for almost 19 years. My wife and I have 4 sons. They range in age from 17 at our oldest son down to our youngest son, who is 5, and then we've got a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old boy in between. And I'm right now halfway through a master's degree at Fuller Theological Seminary. I graduated with a bachelor's in religion from Liberty University at the beginning of 2017. And my dream is to one day go on to teach at the university or seminary level. And so, Lord willing, after I've graduated from Fuller, I plan to go on to PhD studies, specializing in Old Testament. That's where my interest lies, and it's the Old Testament from which I primarily base my case in that book that I just mentioned. So, and as far as what I do for a living, I'm a software engineer. Have been my entire adult life. Most of my career was spent at Microsoft. Now I work at Expedia. And if anybody wants to contact me to talk software or theology, you can befriend me on Facebook. It's easy to find, facebook.com/Chris Date. And I'm happy to get to know you better there. So is that good for an introduction for me? Okay. So as for what Calvinism is, as you say, there are debates within Calvinism. There are so-called high Calvinists like myself, and some people that are not as high Calvinists, and I'll get to explain all of that. But before I do, I just want to make clear that what I'll be defending today, to the extent that defending is required, what I'll be representing today in our discussion is that high Calvinism, not something that would be called by some, lower Calvinism. So my Calvinist view is basically as follows. Number one, God is completely sovereign in every sense of that word. He is not just the Lord of all. He sovereignly foreordains everything that has taken place in time and will take place in time. and that includes the choices of moral agents like human beings. It includes natural occurrences like tornadoes and hurricanes and landslides and so forth. Every single thing that takes place in time is something that God has foreordained to happen. Now, how it is that he brings about what it is that he has foreordained is to a certain extent a mystery. All of us on every side of this debate have to accept a certain degree of mystery. But he certainly, one of the things that he does is use means, secondary means, to bring about the things that he has foreordained in time. So, for example, if he has foreordained that somebody become a believer in Jesus Christ, one of the means that he will use in order to introduce one of the people that he's preordained to be a believer in Jesus Christ is other believers. And that's why evangelism and apologetics and things like that are so important, because we are typically the means by which God reaches those that he has chosen to believe. So number one, my Calvinist view is that God is fully sovereign, completely, it's what's called meticulous divine providence. He foreordains every single thing that takes place in time. Secondly, my view of Calvinism is captured by what has sometimes been called the acronym TULIP. TULIP is a 5-letter word that represents 5 basic doctrines, the first of which is total depravity. The T in TULIP, it represents total depravity, which I take to mean that human beings are, since the fall, by their very nature, rebellious, in rebellion toward God. And if left to their own devices, no matter how persuasive an evangelist's arguments are, no matter how miraculous some event seems to a person, left to a person's own devices, he or she is going to reject Christ no matter what, because we hate Christ in our fallen nature. So that's what total depravity is. The U in the word TULIP represents the phrase unconditional election, which is the view that God, because all of humankind is totally depraved and would not accept Christ left to their own devices, God unconditionally chooses a specific people called the elect who will believe and who will be saved. And it's called unconditional because that choice is not based on anything that God knows that those people have done or are going to do, have believed or are going to believe. There are no conditions met by the elect that causes God to choose them. It's the other way around. They are the elect because God has chosen them to believe and be saved. So that's unconditional election. The L in the word TULIP stands in for the phrase limited atonement. I think a better phrase might be particular redemption, which is the view that Jesus did not die to save every single human being, but rather Jesus died in the stead of, he bore the punishment for the elect and the elect alone. And it's at this point, this L in the acronym TULIP, that most typically you have the high Calvinist distinguished from the so-called low Calvinists or whatever. So a high Calvinist like me believes that Jesus died only for the elect. The so-called lower Calvinist is somebody who would, or 4-point Calvinist would be somebody who affirms the T to U in the letters that I'm about to go on to describe, but they would deny L and they would say Jesus died for all mankind. The I in the word TULIP represents irresistible grace, which is the idea that if God has chosen a person to be the elect, and if Jesus has died in the place of that person and bore the punishment that that person deserves, then there is nothing that will prevent the grace of God from changing that person's heart. Irresistible grace. And then finally, the letter P in the word TULIP represents the phrase perseverance of the saints. So the idea here is sometimes euphemistically relayed using the phrase once saved, always saved, or slightly less euphemistic, eternal security. So the idea here is that once an elect person has been changed by the irresistible grace of God, they will go on to believe, if not for the rest of their lives, then at the very least when they die, such that they will meet the conditions for eternal life and go on to experience it. In other words, it's not possible to be saved and then to stop believing and cease to be saved. We would say that somebody who ceases to believe at some point never really believed to begin with. So when I'm talking about Calvinism, those are basically the two things that I'm affirming. Number one, that God is sovereign over all things that take place in time, and he has indeed foreordained everything that takes place in time, including the choice of people to believe or to disbelieve. And number two, I'm affirming these 5 letters of the acronym TULIP, that human beings are by their nature since the fall totally depraved, that God unconditionally elects those that he chooses to, that Christ died in the place of the elect and the elect alone, that God's grace won't be prevented from changing the hearts of the elect and bringing them to saving belief. And finally, those people that God reaches in that way will never fall away. They will be saved no matter what. Those are the 2 things that I mean. And in that order, by the way, I see all the letters of the TULIP as secondary. It's, for me, what's primary is the fact that God foreordains all things that take place in time. Those 2 things are what I'm talking about when I say I'm a Calvinist.
All right, cool.
Sorry for the very lengthy description.
No, not at all. That was more than, or not more than what I expected. That was just what I expected. A perfect explanation. And then you said that there's 4 point. See, I had never heard of a 4 point. I thought I always heard a 3 point. Does it go all the way down? Like the people do, or
I think there are people who would claim that they are 2.5 or 3 point Calvinists, but I think at that point they've really ceased to be Calvinists. I think it's possible to affirm the 4 points of TULIP to you, I and P, but reject L. Although I think there's some logical problems there. But as soon as you reject a second point of the acronym TULIP, I'm not sure in what meaningful sense one can claim to be a Calvinist anymore. Anyway.
Okay, no, that clears that up for me, because I have heard it, but I see the point that you're saying. And the L is actually, I think that I think is the biggest problem. So it's actually funny learning that there is only one between the upper and lesser, and that one is the one that I think is that does tend present the most problem.
I think you're probably right. I do want to, in defense of people that would not fall under the category of high Calvinism, I think the other point at which some of them, some non-high Calvinists would depart from what I believe is when it comes to the issue of sovereignty as I've described it. I think some less than high Calvinists would also say that God does not preordain every single thing that takes place in time. What he foreordains is the salvation of the elect. I could be wrong about that, but so I would say those are the 2 places at which high and low Calvinists differ the most. One, as you pointed out, limited atonement, and then 2, this idea of meticulous divine providence that I talked about.
All right, okay, I gotcha, and that makes sense, because it is kind of hard to grasp. How could he meticulously put everything in place and then still have sovereignty when it feels like we're doing what we're doing, like we're actually making the choices, so.
And I think we are making choices. I just think that the choices we make have been preordained by God. But yes, I understand that especially in a culture like America's, in which we so prize liberty and freedom, I think it can be a little bit hard to swallow at first. Yeah.
So will you explain to me what preordained means? I think that definition or understanding might clear things up for some people. And then also this is where I think what I see in scripture, some people would say would be, I guess, a form of preordained. But I was wondering what your understanding of it is.
Sure. I don't think that critics of Calvinism who claim that they believe in preordination or foreordination, I don't think they really do believe in preordination or foreordination. I think they're misusing those words. I could be wrong. I'm not a linguist, but my understanding of the words foreordain, preordain, predestinate, and so forth, it means that God causes, ensures perfectly that what he has decreed will happen, will happen. So when, for example, if you look at Acts chapter 4, I believe it is. Let me bring it up just to make sure. Yeah, so this is in Acts 4, verse 27. For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined beforehand to be done. So the idea here is, and you see this all over the place in Scripture, that what happens in time is what God had determined would take place in time. And by determined, I don't mean just predicted. That's not what to preordain or to foreordain or to predetermine means. It doesn't mean that God predicts or knows that something's going to happen. It means that he ensures that it's going to happen. He perfectly, in a first cause kind of sense, is the cause of what is going to happen. I don't know if that helps, but that's what foreordain, preordain, predestinate, that's what those things mean.
Okay. I see what, and I see the problem with, I see why people reject that and deny it, because it seems like tyrannical. You know what I mean? Like it sort of seems like the robot issue. Like if he really preordained, I mean, you're a software engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So if you design something to do a certain thing, it's just basically input output, you know, and there really can't be. It would almost be like saying you could have a true personal relationship with artificial intelligence.
Mm.
You get what I'm saying? Like it's basically put together from an outside source.
I understand the objection. I do. I think there's some problems with the objection. Number one, with robots and with puppets and things of a similar nature, the desired end is brought about by a mechanistic, naturalistic series of chemical interactions. Right, with a puppet, you're dealing with you tug on a string, and because of the forces of nature, the inviolable forces of nature, the hand of the puppet to which the other end of that string is attached gets moved. And similarly with a computer or with a robot, when the programmer's desired result is to take place, a series of electrical currents takes place and circuits fire to naturalistically, mechanistically bring about the desired end. And what's more, neither robots nor puppets have self-consciousness. They are not conscious beings. Humans are conscious beings, and we Calvinists do not think that God's foreordination is manifest through such naturalistic or mechanistic means. It's not always easy for us to explain how that can work, but I think I can offer examples of imperfect examples, but examples of how that might work. So take, for example, imagine you are sitting in a living room with your family watching television or whatever else you might, maybe doing a Bible study or something like that. And let's say you've got a small house, and so there's nowhere to run except your front door if something happens. And sure enough, your front door busts open and somebody throws live bees nests onto the couch, and all of a sudden bees start swarming and stinging all of you. Now you have the ability, the capacity to choose to sit there and get stung. But will anybody sit there and choose to be stung? And the answer is no. Nobody will. Everybody will, in order to prevent themselves from getting stung, either pick up the nest and throw it out, or they'll run out the house and somehow get rid of the bees. So you can cause a human being, a conscious person, to do something perfectly, especially if you're God, without mechanistically or naturalistically causing a series of dominoes to fall, as it were, which is the case with a puppet or with a robot. And I'll offer one more example. If you and I are standing 20 feet apart, I don't know how much distance there is between a home plate and the pitcher's mound, but whatever distance that is, and let's say that it's a smaller distance than that, and we're dealing with a small playground baseball field. If I throw a fastball at your face, and the only two things you have time to do are either get your head out of the way or let the ball hit you, I guarantee you're going to move your face out of the way. Now, you could choose, if you wanted, to let that ball smack you straight in the face and break your nose and maybe cause some permanent vision damage, but you won't choose to do that. And so these are examples that I think illustrate, again, they're imperfect examples, but I think that they illustrate that when you're dealing with a conscious human being that makes decisions, it's not just a naturalistic, mechanistic firing of neurons in the brain that lead inevitably to some choice. That's not what I'm saying, but that is what a puppet or a robot would be. When you're dealing with a human that's not like that, but who is conscious and makes decisions, you can cause them to make a decision, even though they're exercising the choice to make that decision. And so in the same way, or a similar way, I should say, I think that when God preordains the future, even the decisions of agents, moral agents that make choices, I think he can bring about that perfectly without requiring some sort of mechanistic firing of neurons, something akin to a robot or to a puppet. I don't think the analogy or the objection holds up, is what I'm saying.
I got you. No, I see where you're coming from, but I think I can take it to the next level and be like, well, if he's also making all these things here, it's just more of an intricate software engineer. It's a program controlling the program. And so since he's not directing it, so I would still say that it would seem a little tyrannical and without relationship, because if he's going to force this person, like to make them, because he's sovereign, to choose this, and then he's not going to do it to this, it's still, whether he does it directly by the programming or uses the outside forces to then make it still seems as if there's no relationship. It's just acting upon the outside forces that he's doing to make me, rather than a personal one-on-one with my creator, choosing loving. And we'll get into that a little bit more with the limited atonement thing. But what do you, for me, let me explain where I am, because I know what Christendom preaches and I think it's totally incorrect. But what about you do you believe God created everybody?
Yeah.
Do you think
God created everything apart from himself? He's the only thing that has never not existed.
Okay, amen. Do you think he's still creating today?
No, I don't think that he is creating in the creative sense that is described in the opening chapter of Genesis. I think that he is upholding the functioning of the universe, and he is acting in time. But I don't think that he's creating ex nihilo, that is, creating out of nothing. I don't think that he's doing that any longer.
Okay, so how would you explain like your children being created?
Well, without getting too biological, I mean, my sperm, one of them. Okay, you get my point. I mean, there's a biological process there, and what's more, the person that comes into being and begins to develop in the womb is not. There's no new material. There's nothing new being introduced into creation there from the outside. In other words, the developing baby in the womb does not have matter, does not have atoms popping into existence out of nothing the way that it did when God created the universe ex nihilo. There once was no matter and no energy, and then there was matter and there was energy. But in the case of a baby, you don't have something like that.
Okay, well, no, I'm in agreement with you on all this. What about the soul?
Well, I'm not sure to what extent you and I have discussed this, but I do not think that human beings have immaterial souls in the sense that so many Christians do and have done. I am not nearly as convinced of the view I'm about to describe as I am the view of hell that I hold. But I am not a believer in what's called dualism, the idea that human beings have a material body and an immaterial soul. If I think that human beings are physical creatures, and that our consciousness, our minds, our wills, however you want to describe those, I think those describe the functioning of the human brain, and that when a human brain ceases to function, one ceases to be conscious. Now, if I'm wrong about that, and I'm very open to the possibility that I am, then I would say that yes, the one thing that God is continuing to create from nothing are human souls, because I don't think that human souls pre-exist their incarnation in physical form. But so for the sake of argument, I'm willing to grant that and say that yes, the one thing that God is creating from nothing still, even after his day of rest, is human souls.
Right. No, and I followed you all the way through perfectly. But you, I think, because one of the reasons why I'm so descriptive on what the mind, the will, and emotion is, you've done a much greater study in the original language. The psyche, the psyche.
Suke.
I can't even say it right, but it's exactly where we get psychology from. It's the study of the soul. And so there is a difference between flesh, soul, and spirit. So I'm not dualistic. I do think that there's three parts. Like, I think that created in his image speaks of the three persons. Make sure, I think parts and persons means the same thing. Like, I'm Mathias, but my spirit is 100%. My soul is 100%, and my flesh is 100%. I think Ecclesiastes 12:7 says that my flesh is going to go into the ground, and my spirit is actually going to go back to God who gave it. That's saved and lost people alike. So the spirit goes back to God, and the soul is what either goes to paradise or hell. But you and I disagree on the intermediate point. So
and we also disagree on the meanings of the words that you're using. It is true that the Bible uses those Hebrew and Greek equivalents of those words to describe human nature. It uses words like soma in Greek for the body, or gosh, I'm forgetting what the Hebrew word for body is. But in any event, there are words that refer to the human body, and then there's a word that is translated into English as spirit, which is in the Greek pneuma, and in the Hebrew is going to be probably nephesh. And then you have words that are translated soul in English, and it's psyche in the Greek, and in the Old Testament, I think it's also nephesh. But in any event, so yes, there are these three things, but that wasn't really what I disputed. What I disputed is that what those other two things refer to are what you have in mind when you use the words spirit and soul. So for example, I think the passage in Ecclesiastes is a great one to point to, because the word there that's translated spirit in some translations actually refers to the breath of life, the fact that as living creatures we breathe. And the picture here is that when a person dies, his or her breath returns to God who gave it back in Genesis 2 when he breathed into the nostrils of Adam, and Adam became a living being. And words that have to do with the soul, by and large, refer either to an entire person or to a person's life. I see nowhere in Scripture where you can compellingly substantiate that what those words are referring to is some part of man that is a tangible thing, but is immaterial and goes to be in Hades in the afterlife. I don't think that can really be substantiated. So just to be clear, I agree that we have three things, but I don't agree that those three things are the three things that you think they are.
I gotcha. That makes sense. But what you were describing, the breath of life, is part of what I see as the spirit of God that goes back to him. Because with that, when all three come together is when the living soul is in existence, so to speak.
Well, but you said the soul is one of those three things.
The soul is, well,
you said, if I heard you correctly, you said the body, the spirit, and the soul are three things. Correct. But then you said when those three things come together, you have a living soul. But I thought the soul was...
Correct. You have a living soul.
So a living soul
is different than a soul.
Gotcha. I understand. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. A living soul. So it also goes back to created, made, and formed. So created and made, I believe, we're done in the first 6 days. The soul is included. Formed was out of the dust of the ground, and that is what happens in the womb, God doing it. And then when created, made, and formed all come together, the body, soul, spirit come together, that creates the living soul in conception, so to speak.
Okay. Well, this would make for a fascinating discussion on anthropology in a future episode. But maybe you can, sort of to bring the conversation back on topic. How does this relate, do you think, to the issue of meticulous providence?
I was getting right there, because what I see is that, just as I was getting there, is that created and made, that was done on the first 6 days. So I think that God has finished creating everything from the very beginning. And in fact, when he created time, he created with his omniscience. So he knew every time your parents would get together. He didn't make the choice for them to do it. He saw when he created them, everything they would do. And he picked a time to create you. And then once he created you, he saw all the things that would happen in your life because he's omniscient. And this is all right at the very beginning when he created all things, all the generations of the heavens and of the earth, like in one day. But we can't understand that because we're finite beings, but he's infinite. So he saw the whole story played out from creation, but for our benefit. See, even when we pray today, he's actually heard it back here. And all the things were working back here. So as he created is when he actually saw everything. So it was like watching the movie here. So what happens here, this is the replay. So it's not like he's forcing this to happen. It's that when he created, he saw it all.
I understand. You're describing basic foreknowledge. The idea that God knows what's going to happen in the future. Now, I will push back a little bit and just say, it sounds, if I've understood you correctly, as if you're saying it's when God created that he foresaw.
Actually, yes. Yeah.
But that's a huge problem because now I think it sounds like you're denying omniscience because it would mean that prior to creating, God didn't know what those people he would go on to create later would do.
See, and I was trying not to bring it up in the conversations what we talked about beforehand. But I realized talking to open theists, according to the Calvinistic perspective of what omniscience is, I guess I never believed that. I always, because for me in scripture, when I saw Genesis 1 and 2, that's what I saw the first time I read it, so like it sort of just all fell into place from the beginning all the way to the end. And then now that I've read it several times, that's all I still see it. But from the Calvinistic point of omniscience, that God knows everything outside of himself.
That's not just Calvinists. That's also Arminians. I mean, that's basically anybody but open theists.
I hadn't read. Well, the only documents that I've been given are old Calvinist doctrines. So that's the only one, because I haven't done any. I don't look into church fathers. I spend so much time in the Bible. That's all I really ever read because I didn't get saved till I was 29. So for me, or even think that the Bible could possibly be true. And I grew up Catholic, so I was lied to about everything, and then I realized Catholicism and Christianity weren't really the same. So I went into this whole thing like I'm not trusting man at all. I just keep reading. So to then read what people have written, yeah, I believe God's omniscient, but I don't believe that definition of God's omniscient. I think God knows everything. He's the Alpha and Omega. He is the beginning and the end. He is the time. But I don't think the moment that he created each one of us, that he absolutely knew if somebody was going to heaven or hell. Then when he created them, he knew all their decisions, because he's So,
I understand.
because he's omniscient, he could see every single thing that they were ever going to do from the moment he created them, but he
But
didn't
only,
know beforehand.
but he only saw that at the moment that he created them. And by create, you mean something more like planned to create in the future.
Correct.
Yeah.
When God thinks of you, you're created. So I believe everybody was created in the first 6 days because he saw what was going to happen and he picked. He saw what was going to happen and he picked. And so that's what I mean by created. And then also I think that he even did back then, he knew that he was going to do through the natural means. He chose which genes were going to be recessive or, dominant or recessive. So he chose exactly your height, your weight. I
understand. So I'm just trying to make clear for it's all right. I'm just trying to make clear for listeners that what you're describing is not just a rejection of Calvinism, it's a rejection of what virtually most Christians throughout church history have believed, which is that God doesn't just know the future once he decides to make people, but that he knows the future eternally, that eternally into the past, he knew everything that would take place in time, even if he didn't foreordain it, as we Calvinists think. So at least at this point, and there's a lot more I'd want to push back on if we were doing an episode on anthropology. I don't think it makes sense to differentiate between create, form, and make as you did. And so there are some things there that I'd want to push back on. But the point, at least for the topic of this episode, is at this point, we're no longer, it's no longer Calvinism and non-Calvinism. Now it's omniscience as historically defined by almost all Christians, and something less than that kind of omniscience, because it's not until God decides to create somebody that he knows the future of that person. I think that's problematic, but I understand that you're just describing your view for now.
Right. Because that explains for me how God actually sees and knows everything, and everything that he foreknew is going to happen, because we're in the replay.
But why can't he be omniscient as Arminians would say that he's omniscient, meaning he knows what, even before he decides to create somebody in time, he knows that person's future. In other words, he not only knows their future, he knows that he knows when they will come into being, because he's got foreknowledge eternally. How does that make it more difficult for you to explain how he knows the future?
Well, because the moment that's what I'm saying. Like, the moment he created somebody, he knew all of their choices.
The moment he decided to create them.
The moment he decided to create somebody, he then knew all of their choices from birth till grave. And then he decides to create within that. So that's one of the reasons why he knows the very moment that somebody's going to be born. Go ahead.
But the question I'm asking is, why couldn't he know everything even before he decides to create somebody?
Oh, well, the only because I believe it's personal. I think that it's not the Mormon things that you're off in this place and you prove yourself and you come down to earth. In fact, I think the maid makes it to where everybody was actually in Adam's loins when he ate the apple. So I think that that actually even goes down, or the fruit, I should say. But I think that even goes down to why original sin passed down to everybody. Everybody except for Eve was in Adam's loins at that time. So it's just why does he have to know if he doesn't have to? I just think that
no. Let me put the question a different way in case it helps to make clear what I'm asking. Okay. What is it about the decision to create a person that suddenly makes knowledge possible that wasn't possible before he decides to create somebody?
Because of, and I guess this is where I take the problem with God knowing everything and free will. So that
okay, this is good. This is good. So what you're saying, and let me make sure let me see if I can capture this. What you're saying is, I think, basically the same thing that an open theist is going to say, and I'm not calling you an open theist, but it's the same thing an open theist would say, which is that it's not possible to perfectly foreknow what a libertarian free agent is going to choose to do. Is that what you're saying?
It's In a sense, yes. In a sense, to answer the question, in a sense, yes. But the difference is a open theist does not believe that there's time.
That's not true.
Well,
Quite the opposite. Open theists absolutely believe there's time. In fact, the forerunners of open theists were process theologians, and the whole point of process theologian is that everything is process, including God Himself, and process by definition requires time. So in any event, so open theists think there's time. What
Go ahead.
But what open theists say though is it's not possible to know perfectly what a free agent is going to choose to do.
Right. But what they don't, all the ones that I've met, and it's only 4, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting. What's the word? They're presentists. They believe the present is only what's real. The time is just.
I see what you're saying.
So they don't think God is outside of time. That most open theists. And that's where I should have said.
Okay, no, that's good. So let's keep this going. So you're saying you do believe God is outside of time.
Outside he's outside of time. Yeah, he's outside of time. He created time, but he worked inside of time, and now we're experiencing it in time.
I understand. But if he's outside of time, then being outside of time, wouldn't he know what a person is going to do even before he decides in time to create that person?
I don't necessarily think he was thinking about what he was going to do before he started time. I don't know what he was doing beforehand. I'm not saying, I have no clue. I'm not putting anything towards it. I'm just saying that everything inside of time, I don't think he was thinking about it from eternity's past.
Well, I'm not talking about actively thinking about it. I'm just talking about what he knows. What is the content of his knowledge? And most Christians, both Calvinists and Arminians, would say that the content of God's knowledge includes perfectly the future, even before he decides to create anybody. And I'm just wondering, what is the problem with that from your perspective? And I'm not sure I understand that, but that's okay.
Right. Well, I'm trying to understand how I can answer it, actually. If there really isn't a problem with him being able to do that. Like I just don't see that being what Scripture says when it talks about I knew you before you were in your father's loins, talking about like a couple generations prior. If God knew the choices before us, that's it. The reason why is because that takes away from God actually being specific and conscious and direct in every single person's creation. I don't like chance to creation, and I don't think God chose you to sleep with anybody. So God knew what choices that would make. And because he opens the womb, keeps it closed, because he's in charge of all life and all death through his omniscience, because he's infinite. And when he created, you got to think of all of time, he created it and it was just mushed up right here. And I get that from Genesis 2, 4, and 5, those 2 verses. Because I think he created all the generations of heaven, which would be the angels, and all the generations of the earth. And I get it from him. He thinks of it as creation.
That's good. I'm glad that we're getting to the text now, because I think what you'll find, and this is going to be something that we're not going to have the time to unpack in this episode, but it's something for you and for our viewers to go research later. This language of these are the generations does not, in this context anyway, refer to generations of successive generations of creatures, conscious creatures. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth here does not mean these are the generations of creatures in the heavens and the earth, namely angels on the one hand and humans on the other. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they are created means the description that follows it describes how heaven and earth were created. That's what this language means. Now, again, I don't have the time to substantiate that now, but.
Well, no, any Friday night you're open, let me know, because I look to fill Fridays, so we can go through. We can say, hey, we'll just put it off to, and actually just discuss that topic one evening. So.
Well, sure, and I'd love to talk about that in a future episode, but just for the time being here, I mean, if you just continue to read on the text, you'll see what I mean. After saying these, that is what follows are the generations of the heavens and the earth. He goes on to describe plants. He goes on to describe rain. He goes on to describe dust and so forth. So what is being described here is the creation of the heavens and the earth, not the creation of successive generations of human beings thousands of years in the future.
Look at verse 5. The way that I look at it is that every tree and plant and animal before it was in earth was created in heaven first. So I look at that as like God actually put the seed in for every tree. And like how you look at meticulously ordained, God knows which tree is actually going to sprout. And like he did all this in heaven before it was in earth. So that
I understand.
That's actually so I'm with you on the meticulous, and he knows everything, but it's just because he's infinite and he can actually see everything in time meshed from the beginning to end at once, and we can't. So we're playing it out for our experiential, like this. This is where he learned everything in the fact outside of himself. He's omniscient. He knows everything, but the personal relationship, get to know you, not like I created you and I know everything about you, but I know everything about you, but I want to know you, kind of thing.
Okay. Well, I want to take us to a text in a moment. Before I do, I want to highlight for those of viewers who are here that aren't used to your show. This is where there are going to be some challenges, some difficulties that we'll be unable to overcome, because we're dealing here now with translations of the original text. And you're right, the King James Version speaks in a way that sounds like on the surface, like it might lend itself to what you're describing. The text is, "in every plant of the field before it was in the earth." But translations that I think better capture what the original Hebrew means, say things like, "when no bush of the field was yet in the land." In other words, it's not talking about things in heaven that God has not yet planted into the earth. Rather, it's saying it's describing a time before there were plants in the earth. It would be as if I said, there's not even, nobody's even here yet. I'm not saying that there are people in my mind that I'm going to implant here in a moment. I'm saying that there's no one here yet, but they will be soon, or something. So I just want to call that out for your listeners. I don't hold the King James in the same esteem that you do, and so that will present some difficulties here.
Well, but I don't hold the King James, esteem the King James the way that you guys have been treated on this broadcast before.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So I only read the King James. So for me to see the other translations, I just don't do it unless I'm researching the topic. Now, when I read scripture, I thought that that's what it was saying, Genesis 1 and 2. I thought I saw it clearly, and it wasn't until I talked to like 5, 6, 7 people to where I realized, am I the only person who sees it this way? So, I get that that it's not traditional, and that my view will be tinted from the wording in the King James, because for 9 years, that's all I've read. I just don't. It's not that I think people can't get saved in another version. I'm not going to say, oh, I need it in the King James. I don't mind coming to points and be like, oh, well, if we disagree on the wording and it comes down to the text, okay, so be it. That makes sense. But I want to learn and know all points of view. And what you just said makes sense. I think mine sounds more like God, just like, wow, that's really, that's how I took it when I read it. I was just like, that's it. It's a little magnificent, rather than a description of more natural. Like what your explanation of the trees before there were trees in the ground. It's just very detailed in the natural way of playing it out. But if you really did see and it all played out beforehand and it actually happened, so to speak, in heaven before it was in earth, that's almost like, wow, like, and the wow factor should not affect doctrine if it's right or not by any means whatsoever. But, that's just, I'm just explaining where I was, especially for me. I was 2.5 years old in the Lord when I actually read the Bible for the first time and came to this, wait, that's what it said? Because from before that, I was just listening to other men, going to Bible studies, watching sermons. It wasn't important to me to just get in the Word itself. But ever since then, that's all I do is just read cover to cover, cover to cover. I don't even care how much I read in a day or how little. I just keep reading as much as I can. And I don't do studies either anymore. I just go straight through it.
Well, I think that's very commendable, and the reading through the Bible part from cover to cover, I myself would like to have the discipline to do so, and haven't yet. But my hope, and I'm just being honest, my hope is that one day you'll start to read through the Bible in better translations. That having been said, putting that issue aside, let's go to a particular text and bring it back to the topic at hand. And I'll start to actually make an argument for the kind of sovereignty that I've described. And like I said, for me, my interest is mostly in the Old Testament. And when I recently read through the book of Genesis, there were a number of things that really stood out to me as impossible in the kind of simple foreknowledge view that you're describing, and which only makes sense if God is meticulously provident in the way that I've been describing. And so I'll give you just one example, and we can go from there. You're probably familiar with the story of Abraham's servant when he goes to, not Abraham's servant, Isaac's servant. It is Abraham's servant who sends his servant to Nahor to find a wife for his son Isaac. Right. So when his servant arrives there, and this is in Genesis chapter 24, and I'll start in verse 12. The servant prays to God and says, "O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day and shew kindness unto my master Abraham. Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. And let it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, let down thy pitcher, I pray thee that I may drink. And she shall say, drink, and I will give thy camels to drink also. Let the same, that is, let her, be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac, and thereby shall I know that thou hast shewed kindness unto my master." So, for people that don't speak King James English, the point here is that the servant arrives at the well and prays to God, "Hey, I'm going to ask for drinks of water from women as they approach the well. Let the one who proactively volunteers to get me and my camels water, let her be the one that you have appointed to be my master's bride." Now, here's the interesting thing. Immediately after he finishes that prayer, the prayer is answered. And it's answered in remarkable detail. So I'm going to read here, and here's the point I'm getting at. And what I'm going to do is read a paragraph from my book, just because I write better than I speak, and encourage listeners to check it out. But once I finish this paragraph, I'll open it up to you, and we can talk further. This is what I write. This is at the bottom of page 28 of my book. "It is easy to overlook the degree of providence required to answer the prayer of Abraham's servant, but a great number of acts of human agency must have been involved. Rebekah not only granted his request for water, she volunteered to water his camels as well. She had left the well at precisely the time necessary and walked at the rate necessary to arrive just as the servant finished praying. She and her family had finished consuming all their water at just the right time to prompt her to need water at this very moment to retrieve more water in the first place. Either countless suitors had chosen not to propose to her despite Rebekah's beauty, or her family had chosen to decline all such requests, and her kindness, no doubt, was owing in part to excellent parenting by her father and mother, who had married and conceived at just the right time, such that Rebekah was of the age to be approached by Abraham's servant. And surely countless other acts of human agency made this scene possible as well. So the idea here is, in order for what happened to have happened in the way that it happened when it happened, it wasn't enough for God simply to know the future. He had to bring it about, because apart from doing so, and apart from, and he must have done so in numerous ways in order for things to work out just the way they did. If he hadn't done that, there's no way that this woman that God had appointed for Abraham's servant, or Abraham's son, would show up and do exactly what the servant prayed he would do. So this is, for me, one of numerous examples in which God's action in time, the unfolding of history reveals that God not only knew what would happen, but foreordained it all to happen precisely as it did. And what I'd be interested to hear from you is, how do you, coming from a perspective of God knowing that this would happen but not causing it, how do you explain the intricate detail and so many things that had to align perfectly in order for the Abraham servant's prayer to be answered in the way that it was?
Well, I don't think too much intricately has to be performed, or too many different things. I do think, like what you were saying, God can, he works within time, and he does use outside influences to help direct us in a way that he wills. But I think that goes along with, if we align our will with his, that's when prayers get answered and things like that. But God's will does get done, and sometimes he uses the lost, even through directing them to do different things by outside influences on them to influence different things. I would say a best way to explain it is, I think God knew Jonah. He knew his personality, and he chose to choose Jonah so that because he knows Jonah would run away, so that he could get that story and put it in the New Testament, because everything was for an example, even though it was history, straight up history, it happened. But everything that happened back here was for an example here. So I think that he knew, sort of like with Mary, he knew his faithful servants. Also knew that when it comes down to the camels, I would say that God whispered into the ears of the servant of Abraham to add that in, knowing that was it Leah or Rebecca, that Rebecca would come and be the person like, hey, I'm not just going to get you, I'm going to get your camels water too. So I would say that I don't think he necessarily forced her, but he knew her. And when you know somebody, you kind of know what they would do, and you can, like I said, I bet an angel whispered, hey, why don't you say... Boom.
Okay, but it sounds like what you're saying is that God knew that she would be at the well at the right time, and knew that she would be of the kind of character that would prompt her to offer to water somebody who arrives and asks for it. But
yes, A, no. B, yes, he knew that. A, he helped direct that as well.
So now consider all of the steps along the way where God had to be directing things in order for this to come to pass exactly as it did. Again, going, in that paragraph I just read, I went from the past or the present into the past, but I'll go from the past into the present. God would have had to have directed the conception of Rebecca at just the right time, so she'd be of age for Abraham's servant to approach her. Her parents would have had to have raised her to have the kind of character, the godly character that would prompt her to volunteer to water this person's wells. She's described in the Bible as being extremely beautiful, and yet apparently either no suitors ever approached her parents asking for her hand in marriage, or her parents turned them all down. So there you've got God directing things through years and years, well, not years and years, but at least several years of this young maiden's age, preventing her from getting married before this point in time. You've got the family in which the family she was a part of happening to drink all the water at just the right time to prompt her to come out and get water in the first place. And this is only scratching the surface. Are you saying that God was working to direct all these various things that have happened along the way, so that what would happen exactly as it's described here happened in this way? Because at that point, what's the difference between what you're describing and what I'm describing?
Well, we'll see, because one of the because not all of it. I would say that I would say that, how about when I pray today, I try to wrap my mind around this, because this is actually what I believe. When I pray today, God heard it at the foundation of the world and started working to answer that prayer, even, like leading up to this moment in time when I'm actually praying it. But he heard it at the beginning, and he was working all sorts of things from there. So when that servant did pray, I do believe it was heard from the foundation of the world. And yes, everything, God does work in time. I don't think that he is not maneuvering different things to move, to get his perfect will done. I think he absolutely is, like to make the wind blow in certain times and different things, not just abstractly or naturally, but to blow a water pot down to make somebody have to go get water at a certain time that day. Now, it could have been Leah or Rebecca or somebody else from the layman. I'm not good on all their...
I'm not either.
On all the names. I get everything mixed up. But it could have been any of the people, as long as it was from Abraham's family. So I don't think it had to have been, precisely get them to conceive, to have Rebecca be that person. Like, I don't think Mary necessarily had to be that person. It could have been another maiden that was obedient.
Well,
and then we would have written about that instead.
Okay. So let me take two aspects of that. One, if she had been born, say, 10 years later, and she were only a small child when Abraham's servant arrived at the well, she wouldn't have been of marrying age, right?
Right.
Okay.
So wait, say that one more time.
If she had been born, say, 10 years later, I don't think we're giving her exact age, but if she was of marrying age, she must have been between 14 and 24 or something like that. If she'd been born 10 years later than she would have, I think, been a 10-year-old or something like that at the time that Abraham's servant arrives at the well. And would that have been marrying age, do you think? Do you think it would have been appropriate for Abraham's servant to marry, or for Abraham's son to marry a 10-year-old girl at that time?
No, but the story does put in to where he could have been serving for Leah for 7 years. And
well, the point, okay, then make it 20 years instead of 10. The point I'm getting at is that she wouldn't have been of the age to be married at this time.
But it didn't have to be Rebecca, is what I'm saying.
Okay, but even if we say it could have just been anybody else, anybody to have come out to the well at precisely the instant that his servant ceases praying his prayer, any girl to arrive at just the right time would have had a host of things happen in order to prompt her going to the well at that very specific point in time. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Well, see, and also it could be from the beginning of time, God had planned that Rebecca and Isaac were going to get together. So, or not planned it, but already knew it, already foresaw it, because from my view, he already foresaw it. So when Abraham's servant prayed, all God had to do, because this was already played out that Isaac and Rebecca were going to be together. All the things, to intricately set that up had already played out because God foresaw it, and that's how it happened. So the only thing he really had to change was getting her out there that day and having the guy pray about the camels. That's the only thing he necessarily had to get in and poke and change. So maybe Rebecca, wasn't planning on going out that day. Maybe it was somebody else, but that person God made to where they were sick. So Rebecca had to go out that time, and God made it to where the message didn't get to Rebecca on time. So she didn't get out there the time she would have if she knew beforehand. There's a whole bunch of things that could have happened that
Okay.
I just think that all God did was shift a little bit of things, but then also he shifted them back here when he sees all of time play out. Time is actually melding from start to finish because we're praying back and forth, but God can see it all as if it's...
Well, but you didn't say he just sees it all. You said he also directs things at times as well. So it sounds like what you're describing is that from the foundation of the world, God foreordains some things to take place, but he leaves other things up to the decisions of free agents. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
It's not that he foreordained; it's that he saw everything. But prayer,
no.
But prayer actually matters.
No, you didn't say. Well, I think prayer matters too, but we'll get to that at some point, maybe in this course of the conversation.
But I was saying that I wasn't saying that you didn't. Okay. But I was saying that it's that even though God saw what was going to happen, so now he sees everything that's going to happen, but now there's prayers that go back. And so now he's actually working inside it, but still it's all happened in creation week.
Well, but so it's I don't think that changes what I said. If I've understood you correctly, what happened here most likely is a case where God foresaw that that Abraham's servant would arrive when he did and be seeking for a wife for Isaac at the time that he arrived at the well, and heard his in advance in the creation week, heard the servant make this prayer, and because prayer really matters, God changes a few things in the course of history to make sure that she comes out right when she does. So it's exactly as I said. God ordains some things to happen. He causes some things to happen
through prayer. Yes.
Okay.
And that's what I meant when I said prayer matters. Yes, he will step in and foreordain through the request of his beloved.
Okay, well let's talk about another text then where it seems like you can't have or there doesn't appear to be any recourse to somebody praying that something would happen, and yet we still see God, seemingly anyway, causing it to happen. So this is what I'd like us to do now is to go to Genesis 50, verse 20. And the background to this text is the story of Joseph and his brothers. Listeners will recall that, or viewers, for those that are watching, will recall that Joseph's brothers had thrown him into a pit, and fortunately for them, some traders arrived, and so they trade him into slavery, and he's taken into Egypt, where he serves Egypt's he serves Potiphar, I think was his name, but Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of trying to seduce her, and so he gets thrown into jail, and he interprets the other prisoners' dreams, and so he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man, because then he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, yada, yada, yada. There's a famine in the land. I'm fast forwarding now. There's a famine in the land, and Joseph's brothers come to him, and they're looking for food, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him, and then he sends them back and forth to their home a few times. Fast forward to now, Joseph has, here in chapter 50, Joseph has revealed his identity to his brothers, and his brothers are more remorseful, regretful, or maybe just afraid of being punished for what they did. But either way, Joseph says this to them in Genesis 50, verse 20. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. Now this is my screen went dark. Are you still there?
Yeah, I was trying to
Okay.
get the scripture up. Sorry.
Gotcha. All right, good. So Genesis 50:20. So this text is not, I think, it's not translated imperfectly, but it is important to note that the word translated thought by the King James Version is the exact same word that is translated meant a few words later. I'll read from the ESV for those listeners and viewers who don't mind the ESV. It says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Now, the evil that is referred to here could arguably be called something more like calamity or disaster. It's a reference to Joseph's brothers having intended evil, calamity, disaster for Joseph. And how do we know that? They threw him into the pit and then they threw him into slavery. But Joseph says, you meant evil or calamity or disaster for me. You intended it, and sure enough, you did it. He doesn't say that here, but it's implied. But God meant it for good. And here's the important part about this. The word meant in the King James translates the same word that moments before was translated thought. It's the exact same verb. The first use of the verb, Joseph's brothers are the subject of the verb. The second use of the verb, God is the subject. So two different subjects, same exact action, and the object of that action is evil, calamity, disaster, whatever. That's the object of the verb meant or thought. And the Hebrew behind God meant it, the object of his meant, his intended, his thought. The object, it's not just a repeat of the word evil, it's literally a reference back to the word evil. It's what's called a pronoun, it, referring back to the evil. So you have two different agents, God, Joseph's brothers, exact same action, meaning something to happen, same exact object, evil, calamity, disaster. The only way that I think that you can say that that Joseph can say to his brothers, you meant evil for me, but God meant it for good, is to say that to the very same extent Joseph's brothers were responsible for him being thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and ended up experiencing the history that he does in Egypt. The only way that Joseph's brothers could have meant that calamity for him and brought it about is if God also was responsible for bringing it about. He equally meant for evil to happen for calamity to happen to Joseph. It's just that their motivations were different. Joseph's brothers meant for this calamity, this evil, this disaster to happen to Joseph because they intended him harm. They intended him evil. But God caused this calamity, this disaster, this evil to happen to Joseph. God intended it to happen, meant it to happen, caused it to happen. But he meant it with good purposes in mind. Namely, as readers of the story discover, the salvation of Egypt, and this not the spiritual salvation, but the physical salvation. Because Joseph advised Pharaoh, he was able to prepare for the 7 years of famine. So, what I'd be interested to hear from you is, there's nothing in here where anybody prayed that God would and nobody prayed that Joseph would be sold into slavery. Nobody prayed for that somebody would arise from within Egypt to advise Pharaoh and bring about the deliverance of Egypt from famine. So I don't think you can appeal to God sort of looking forward in time to somebody's prayer, and in response to that prayer, tinkering with the details in future history in order to bring it about. I don't think you have recourse to that. All you have here is Joseph's brothers and God's being both the subject of the exact same verb, exact same direct object of that verb, which is the calamity that befell Joseph. And that calamity was brought about by human agents, namely Joseph's brothers. So how do you explain that what Joseph's brothers meant, the calamity meant by Joseph's brothers for Joseph was equally meant by God, but with a different purpose? How do you explain that apart from the kind of providence I've been describing?
Well, let me switch back to camera view. Actually, I think maybe you might have just given me an answer to one of my questions.
Okay.
Because it wasn't Joseph's brothers who did it. If you read the story carefully, they didn't do it. They meant to, but God sent somebody else to pull him out. Remember, they went back to go get him, but he was gone already. He rent his clothes because the child was gone. They didn't know. Then they dipped.
Well,
they had no clue what
hold
they
on.
were like. So they meant it for evil. They did mean it for evil, but God meant it for good. He actually sent somebody else to take him out of where they put him and to send him into Egypt to save the flesh.
I hear what you're saying. It sounds like what you're saying is Joseph's brothers planned one thing, God planned a different thing, and God caused to happen what he planned and not what his brothers planned. That doesn't work here. The grammar of this text, because of the grammar of the Hebrew here, or even the grammar of the English and the King James here, doesn't make that possible. What?
Well, I would say because it would still be evil for, and I forget the name of the group that was coming, that they actually took him out, and they wanted to sell him for slavery for their own good. But God meant for that evil to be for the good of Jerusalem and saving them throughout the famine, not being put into there.
But again, that doesn't work with the grammar even of the English and the King James. Because in the King James, what Joseph says is, ye, my brothers, thought evil against me. Now, the against me in grammar is unimportant here. What's important for the sake of what we're discussing here is ye thought evil. Okay? But then the text goes on to say, God meant it. Okay? That it is a reference back to the evil that his brothers thought.
Oh, well, I see what you're saying. I was taking, I guess, evil more general.
Okay.
Not specifically that evil, but evil.
But even if that were true, here it says God meant it. However you take evil, the evil that was thought or meant by Joseph's brothers, God meant it. So how does God mean evil in the abstract?
Well, see, because I don't take God meant what they were intending for.
But
I see how you're saying it, so it's directing back to their intention, but I take it back to the evil itself. Like, they had their own intentions, and God, I don't think, forced them or wanted them to necessarily have those intentions.
But the thing that this text, even in the King James, says they intended is the very thing it says God intended. The text, even in the King James, says, ye, my brothers, thought evil. And just to remove some of the emotions here, to remove some of the philosophy here, let's just replace the word evil with X. Okay, just so that we can be totally sterile here and objective. Ye thought X is what Joseph says, but God meant it. And the it is a reference back to X. So the very thing, the very X that Joseph's brothers meant is what God meant.
Well, see, and also I would say that some of that would have to be from the stories that we get that precurse it. The couple of dreams. I think that God meant for them to be agitated with him and gave Joseph such dreams to help agitate them, to then put them so far to put them into a pit. So I do think that that in that aspect, like, God gave him the dreams to then, he meant for them to react in that way. Sort of like Samson. He knew Samson was weak from the beginning. Like, he knew all that. And I think that he meant for Samson to be captured for the purpose of delivering Jerusalem from the Philistines, or the Hebrews from the Philistines, because when he pulled everything down, he took more in his death than he did in his life, and that actually freed the Jews. So, like, I think that God gave him the strength from the beginning, knowing that that strength would be enough, and actually help direct with Samson's free will, because Samson was, going after a Philistine woman when he shouldn't have, but God meant it, his parents didn't know, but God meant it to be an occasion against them so that God could deliver the Jews from. So I think there's an intertwining that just shows God working within time as the same time as knowing. But from the beginning of the foundations of the world. Like, I think that there's a dualistic that we can't fathom because we're going in the timeline and we're finite. But if we could understand his ways, we would see it how he does. But we're not infinite, so that's it's one of those things.
But going back to this specific text, if I understood you correctly, what you said is, yes, God did mean what Joseph's brothers also meant, and that he brought it about by, he triggered it, if you will, by giving Joseph dreams that would enrage his brothers and cause them to do what they did. Right?
Correct. And even as much as
you're a Calvinist. That's all as a Calvinist I'm saying, is that God intends for something to happen in time, and he brings it about through secondary means. You've literally said exactly that. God intended for his brothers to do what they did, and he brought it about by the means of dreams.
And I guess my difference would be that it goes through with free will, as in opposed to
Calvinists think so. It's just we don't agree that free will is the same thing that you understand free will to be.
Right. I gotcha.
So,
but yeah,
this is something I go into a little bit more detail in my book. But people who hold to what's called libertarian free will, the kind of free will I think that you mean when you use a phrase free will, they use the phrase free will to mean that, and then they just say, well, Calvinists deny free will, but that's not quite right. We Calvinists believe in free will as well. We just don't believe it's libertarian free will. We believe that human beings choose to do what they want to do. We have a nature. That nature is fallen. It's rebellious. Our nature is influenced over the course of development, both in the womb and thereafter. It's influenced by the choices of our parents and the choices of our friends and the experiences that we go through, and so on and so forth. So that when we make a decision, it is what we want to do, but what we want to do has been shaped by our lives and by the fall. This is what's called compatibilist free will. It's the idea that human freedom is compatible with the kind of sovereignty that I've been describing on the part of God. But it's not libertarian free will. It's not the freedom to, Joseph's brothers wouldn't have and couldn't have chosen to do other than they did. They did what they wanted to do. And a libertarian free will person would say they were equally capable in every sense of that word of doing the other, of not selling him into slavery. But we compatibilist free will people would say otherwise.
I would say that they were free. See, okay, so where do I fit in on this? Because I would say that they would be absolutely free to not do it.
Yeah,
but then also God would. God would also know that.
Yeah, libertarian.
But then also
believe that
work. Okay, well, because God, if they absolutely did not, God would have worked some way else to save Israel. The way, like, I don't think that. Let me. I have no clue. So let me just put it that way. But let's use Mary as an example. I think that if God knew that she wouldn't have accepted free will, hey, I'm your servant, let it be unto me as what you said. If he knew she wouldn't, he would just find somebody else. So we wouldn't have had Mary, we would have had Shelley. I just think that God's will would have been done. The Messiah would have been born, and it would have been done at that time, but God would have found another vessel of his. Elijah thought he was the only one, but there were 6,000 who had not bowed the knee. So, I just think that And that's partly how God uses us even today. We say, God, send me, I'm a vessel. That's when he'll use us. But then again, he knew that from the foundation of the world. So
I understand, but the point I'm getting at, just going back to this text, is where we ended up was with a view that is hardly distinguishable, your view, distinguishable between your view and mine. Both of us are saying God meant for what happened to happen. We both think that he caused it to happen, in part at least by means of these dreams that he gave Joseph that would enrage his brothers. So we have God sovereignly working in history to bring about his desired end. And the only difference between us is that I'm saying he does that 100% of the time, and you're saying he does it something less than 100% of the time. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Okay,
I mean,
okay, so this is good, because toward the end of this part of my book, here's what I write, and it sounds to me like this is yeah. So this is a paragraph that I write that touches on that difference between us, my 100% versus your less than 100%. I say it's difficult to square this less than 100% issue, which with the biblical data, which indicates that God exercises providence over all human agency. Daniel, for example, tells Nebuchadnezzar that the motley statue in his prophetic dream symbolizes a series of subsequent kingdoms. This is Daniel 2:31-40, and that it is God who removes kings and sets up kings. And then later he tells Nebuchadnezzar the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Job similarly says God looses the bonds of kings and binds a waistcloth on their hips, leads priests away stripped and overthrows the mighty, pours contempt on princes and loosens the belt of the strong, makes nations great, destroys them, enlarges nations, leads them away. We have other texts like Ephesians 1:11, in which God says, in which God is said to have worked all things according to the counsel of his will, and that for those who love him, all things work together for good. This is Romans 8:28. We have Psalm 139:16, in which the psalmist praises God, in whose book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. And then James says, you ought to say, to those who arrogantly assume that their plans are going to be successful, James says in James 4:15, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. And on I go. So the point of this is just to say, it seems to me, based on just the few texts we've looked at thus far, that the burden of proof isn't on me as a Calvinist to prove that all events in time are foreordained or directed by God, because every single event we've looked at has borne evidence of him directing things to come up to happen the way they do. The burden of proof, it seems to me, is on non-Calvinists to prove that there are any events in time that are not directed or foreordained or predetermined by God. So I've been challenging you a lot, and with what time we've got left, maybe I'll make myself vulnerable to you and give you an opportunity to push back on me. Can you give me any event in Scripture that you can prove was not brought about by God's sovereign determination or foreordination?
Well, I mean, a couple things show in, like, all right, this kind of goes into the one of my main problems with the foreordained, as in he pushed everything 100%, are things like child sacrifice and the wickedness. I think that with free will, you get the choice to involve God, good, not involve God, evil. So evil is just the word that is, lack of God. So I don't think there's something God created. I think that you just have the choice to have him or not. Go ahead.
Okay. So if let me put what I think you're saying back to you and tell me if this is right. What he doesn't cause, what he doesn't preordain, foreordain, predetermine to happen are acts of evil. Is that right?
No.
No, I'm wrong, or no, I'm right?
He does not preordain acts of evil, but he uses everything that happens.
Sure. I understand that. That's a view I once held. Okay, so let me then pose this question to you. What is the single greatest act of evil that any human being or human beings have ever performed?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. I would say just simply unbelief. But
You think that's worse than the murder of the Messiah?
I believe the unbelief is the reason why I say that is because it's the only thing that's going to send somebody to hell. So that's why I would put unbelief first. But
okay, then second, besides unbelief,
right.
Let me put it another way: is there any act of human evil, any human act of evil worse, any act of evil worse, any sin worse than murdering God incarnate in human flesh? Perfect, sinless human being, totally undeserving of his murder. He's murdered. Is that? Would you at least agree that that's one of the most heinous acts of human history?
Yes, but the reason why I say it the way that I do is because it's also the most beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. But it's nevertheless the people who killed him certainly didn't mean for it to be beautiful. So in terms of their motives, in terms of why they did what they did, the murder of the Messiah, the murder of the perfect sinless God-man, is at least one of the greatest acts of human evil ever. Correct? Or would you agree?
Yeah, but I mean, I would also say that abortion in the womb would be, in a sense, killing all, not the purity, but the innocent, the same sense of innocence.
But they're not. But they're also inheritors of original sin. So even though they haven't yet sinned, they are sinful. They are fallen. Whereas Jesus was perfect and sinless and completely undeserving of anything negative that happened to him, right?
Well, that was why I didn't say pure. I said innocent.
Okay, but I guess the point I'm getting at is the fact that Jesus is not only innocent but also pure, and also God in human flesh, not bearing not having a sinful nature, not being a part of fallen humanity. Wouldn't that seem to indicate that the murder of Jesus Christ is one of the worst evils that human beings have ever committed?
Yeah, I'm not denying that at all.
All right. So this is the question I'm going to pose to you then, because I asked you, number one, can you point me to any acts in time, any human decisions in time that God didn't bring about, didn't determine, etc.? And you said human acts of evil.
Well, I was referring to it never came into my mind. Speaking of the child sacrifice,
I understand, but the point I'm getting at is, okay, but you went on to say that no, God doesn't foreordain human beings to commit evil.
he from my point of view, he does, but your point of view, I don't think he does. Like, I think foreordained is just he saw it.
Well, see, this is what I meant. Foreordained doesn't mean foresee. Foresee means foresee. I'm saying,
Okay.
Does God cause, predetermine, foreordain, ensure that any human act of evil is committed? And you said no. He does not ensure that a human being commits an act of evil.
Right.
Okay,
I would
good.
I would say not, and I would also say that because that's also why not even the acts of the principalities. So I think that's also why it got kept it a mystery.
I understand, but the point I'm getting at is you said God. We covered the ground that he works in time to bring about certain things that he foreordains. And when I said the difference between us is that I think he does that for all things in time, and you said some things in time, you said at least one thing that he doesn't sovereignly bring about, does not ensure happens, are human acts of evil. And then I asked you, and then I got you to agree that at least one of the most heinous human acts of evil was the murder of the perfect, innocent, sinless God-man.
Right.
Okay? So then the question I have for you is, what do you do with texts like, and this isn't the only one, but I think this is one of the most powerful, Acts 4, verse 24, where the early church, a few years after this very murder that we've just been talking about, They say, actually, I'll go to verse 27. For of a truth, against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, so that you've got four human parties there. You've got Herod, you've got Pilate, you've got the Gentiles, and you've got the people of Israel. They were gathered together, verse 28, to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. Now, I don't think there's any way to read this. I don't think there's any way to read it in such a that escapes the implication that God that God determined, caused, ensured that Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel would do whatever to Jesus that God determined them to do. Now that's not foreseeing, that's not foreknowing. That's determining something to happen. It's causing it to happen, and specifically what he's causing to happen is the murder of his son at the hands of Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the Jews. So how do you explain that?
Well, I would also say, remember, I think it was Herod. No, not Herod. The high priest, Caiaphas. Remember, he prophesied, not even knowing. Like, he said, one man's got to die for the sins. So God will even work through the lost, and they sometimes don't even know it. It's kind of funny how that works sometimes.
But notice that the text here doesn't say God used what he knew Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel would do to Jesus.
Well, but
it says he determined them to do it.
Right, and I would say that he helped keep everything a mystery, because had the princes have known what God was going to do in a supernatural way on the cross, they wouldn't have crucified him in the first place. So I think that he kept it a secret of what he was going to do, but also at the same way he hardened Pharaoh's heart and conscience, help get them in a place to where they were yelling, crucify him, crucify him, probably even agitating the whole Barabbas deal to get people to, and really at this point, I think that we have supernatural help from the princes. Like, this is what the verse is talking about. I don't think it was just human. I think the devils, I think Satan thought that he would win victory over actually putting to death, the son of the vineyard, to get his inheritance, that parable. And so that God knew that, and also knew how they are self-righteous and, prideful, and that if the Son of God is here, and they're like, look, if we leave him alone, everyone will believe on him and we'll lose our place with the Romans. So he understood that they were just whitewashed sepulchres, and all they cared about was where they were, not the relationship with God. So he used, he stepped back, let the devils think that they were getting their way, put him on the cross, and that's when God imputed him the sins, and I believe of the world. And had they known that, they wouldn't have done that in the first place. So yes, I think God bruised Jesus, and it pleased him, because God has to judge sin, and that's how it's justice for us to have free grace and all. But I think God used it all. He used them and their flesh to be directed by the spiritual wickedness all around, so that God could impute the world's sins into him supernaturally. I think God used it all.
I understand. The problem is this text won't allow that way of looking at it, because it doesn't say that God simply hid the truth from these parties and they did what they did. it says they did whatsoever thy hand, they're speaking to God, and thy counsel determined before to be done. For those viewers who are not fans of the King James or aren't as familiar with it, another way to put it is the way the ESV puts it, the English Standard Version, which is, truly in this city, this is verse 27, truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So God, according to the early church here in this passage, had predestined or determined for Jesus to be killed and to have done to him everything that was done to him by Herod, by Pilate, by the Gentiles, and by the people of Israel. This isn't a text that simply said God knew it. And it's not even a text that says that God just sort of influenced things here and there to make sure that in some vague, however the particulars happened, at least he would die. That's not what this text is saying. It says whatever they did to him, God had predetermined that they would do. So,
Right.
so
I get that.
So we're talking Judas selling him to, or betraying him. You're talking him being whipped. You're talking about the crown of thorns. You're talking about that robe, which when it was pulled off of him would have pulled the scabs off of innumerable wounds from the whip, and him carrying the cross and all these things. Every single thing that Herod and Pilate and the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel did to Jesus, God determined them to do beforehand, is what this text says.
Yeah.
I don't understand how you can read that if you think that God doesn't foreordain and sovereignly ensure that evil sometimes is done.
Right. Well, no, I'm not. When I say that God doesn't foreordain, well, I do say he doesn't not foreordain evil. He foreordains some things. He foresaw all the evil and allowed it. But when it comes to the plan of salvation, I do think that would be something he ordained inside of time. And there are some things that, yes, he caused to happen the way that a Calvinist looks at it. I would agree with that, especially when it comes to the plan of salvation. You can't get more perfect of a way that you get a gospel of grace where there's nothing on our part, all the work of God, and yet his justice, his love, his mercy, his grace, everything be intact. Only the plan of salvation that he has come up with in this way that he took all the judgment, we get all the grace, is a way that glorifies him in every way. So I get the plan of salvation, even picking the crown of thorns, being thorns, pointing to our sins, pointing to what he was imputing into his son, and so that he could be judged for us. And so on certain things like this, I don't think that Judas necessarily was born. Of course, he was not. Judas could have believed on the Lord Jesus Christ even after he betrayed him, before he committed suicide. And Judas himself could have been saved. Now, Judas was going to betray him. God foresaw it. That's why he told us about those 30 pieces of silver. That's why we have all the story, but I don't think he forced Judas to do it. In fact, I don't think Jesus necessarily needed to be betrayed in order to be put on the crucifix. That was just a little glimpse in a little blimp in the whatever, a little short little thing in the story there that yes, it did happen. It's necessary to know what happened, but I think Caiaphas did not need Judas in order to take him that night. He could have just sent out the army and somebody who knew what Jesus looked like. But everybody knew what he looked like anyways. They were all following him for 3 years. So,
Well, so I'm happy to let viewers weigh the different answers that we've offered to these texts. But to sort of sum up what I've tried to articulate and defend here, I see in the story of Abraham's servant at Nahor a God who does not merely know the future, but foreordains it in intricate detail. And I see that intricate foreordination playing out even in the worst imaginable, to me anyway, human act of evil, which is the murder of his son. And for these texts and numerous others, I think it's real. I think that Scripture teaches few things as clearly as it does that God is sovereign in the way that I've described Him. And I'm happy to let our viewers weigh the cases and consider the cases that we've offered. Where do you want to take things now? I do just want to let you know I probably have to get off in about maybe 15-20 minutes max.
We can. Why don't we talk about a little precursor of Tulip, or not Tulip, but about limited atonement?
Yeah, sure.
But I would love to, if Fridays are good for you, you let me know your next Friday, and I'll go ahead and schedule it in, and we'll talk about limited atonement that day. And really, I want to talk about the created, made, informed one time, because that I've looked into it a lot, and I'd love to hear the educated version, because mine's only from Bible. I don't look at anything else, so I'm just going, and it is King James too. So when I say educate, I'm just ignorant to anything else, so I just don't know. So I would love to. I don't even know what anthropology even means. I'm so ignorant.
It's just the study of humanity. It just means it's a reference to the study of human nature. But yeah, I'd love to do all that. But I feel bad because I feel like I've sort of dominated this conversation, and limited atonement is an opportunity for you to put me a bit on the defensive. And like I said, I can give you another 15 minutes. Do you want to talk briefly, like you said, a precursor to an upcoming show, and give you an opportunity now to challenge me on the limited atonement thing?
Yeah, I wish I would have thought about challenging questions. But on the because there's you can get so deep so quick. It's just that I was shocked when you told me that the main thing was that one point. I was like, well, that makes sense, because that one point is big. And it goes to what I was just saying, I think that the plan of salvation is beautiful, and how he got imputed with all the world. I think it was all the world's sins, but I think that, that was made to happen. It's just too perfect of a plan to where it's all him and it's none of us, But one thing I do want to talk about, and I think this will probably go more on the limited atonement, faith being a work. A lot of people who reject Calvinism think faith, or don't think faith is a work, where Calvinists, from my understanding, can...
Some do. Some think faith is a work, and they will point to a passage in which, Jesus is asked, what do we do in order to do the works of God? And Jesus says, this is the work of God, believe on me, on him who he has sent. And
I use
some
that
Calvinists, huh?
I use that verse. Right. No, go ahead. Finish.
Yeah. So some Calvinists will say, look, the Bible elsewhere says that salvation is completely apart from works. And here Jesus says that even faith is a work, so therefore salvation must be independent. It must precede, or it must depend on not even whether or not somebody will exercise faith. What I will say is, I'm not one of those Calvinists. I don't think that that's really what Jesus is trying to do here. I think Jesus is not just God, but he's also human, and as a human, and although I think God could do this too, I think he's using. I don't know if sarcasm is quite the right word, or he's being facetious, but however you want to characterize it, I think what he's saying is, and I can only capture this by changing the inflection of my voice. This is the work of God, to believe in he whom he has sent. You know, it's not that Jesus is literally saying that following Jesus and believing in him is a work. I think that he's being a little bit sarcastic, or there's got to be a better word for what I'm describing. But the point is, he's being facetious when he calls it a work. He's saying his point is faith isn't a work. It is the thing that you're saved by. But that's a poor way of putting it. But the point is just that I'm not one of those Calvinists who think faith is a work.
Right. I think inflection might be a good word. Like they might be trying to write that from your perspective. Now, what I think it is
clever is the point that I'm getting at.
I gotcha. What I think it is, and see, a lot of people call me Calvinist, you know, because of a lot of my views. But I do think that faith is a work of God. I think faith is a gift. But I also think...
you mean it's a work that God does?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, you would make a great Calvinist. I mean, we Calvinists wouldn't say that God is the one doing the believing, but we would say that anybody's belief is a gift to that person by God. Yeah.
Well, see, and where I differ from a Calvinist is that I think God has gifted every single person that measure of faith. I think that everybody has that faith. But it's up to somebody to respond. This is when the free will comes in. And when they respond to God, see, he's drawing every man to himself. This is my view. He's drawing every man to himself, and that he's not willing that any should perish, that he is actually draw or searching for them. So when somebody responds to God, he will give them more light. And so if they respond and then act on that truth, he'll give them more light. And so it takes the free will to put on the yoke and learn of him, to strive to enter into that gate, to really search out who Jesus is, so you can know if you're going to trust him or not, because salvation is a personal knowing him. And so I think that when somebody's filling their soul, their mind, their will, and emotion, they're filling their soul with the information. And I do think that if somebody's seeking God, they are safe, because I do think everyone who seeks God will find him, as long as they keep seeking him unto salvation. But when it goes from here to here, this is a moment. This is a work of God. You can do everything to put here. You have to get everything into your soul, but for it to go from your soul to your spirit, to your heart, the center of your being, like the inner thing that makes the quickening happen, that itself is a work of God. You can't make it happen. You can't decide to say, I'm going to believe this and then just get saved. Like, decisionism is what I call it, because you don't decide to believe anything in life. There's nothing in life that you've decided to believe. You've always looked at the evidence, you've been persuaded of it, and now you believe what you have been persuaded of as the truth. And that's the same thing with salvation. So I think this whole decisionism, that you just blind faith type deal, is just a false works-based gospel anyways. But if somebody truly seeks God, and this is where the free will comes in, if they seek him, he will do everything that's needed to give them, which will the eyes will fall, or the scales will fall off the eyes. They'll get eyes to see, ears to hear, so that they can understand with their heart. Like, all that is a work of God, even to be able to believe, because you can't believe with a carnal mind. So I do call it a work of God, and people are like, oh, that's Calvin. I'm like, but I say everybody has that faith, you know. It's not.
So there are 2 points that I want to push back on then. Number one, you said that for anybody who seeks after God, God is going to give this gift. And to that, I would say, well, that's really interesting, because Paul says in Romans 3:11 that there is none that seeketh after God. And then the other thing, all this talk about Everybody has the ability to respond to this light that God gives them, and it's up to them whether or not they choose to respond to it. I think that's very interesting, except that Jesus says in John 6:44, no man can come to me except the Father which hath sent me draw him. And what's interesting, hold on. And what's interesting about this is that Jesus is specifically explaining why the people that he's speaking to aren't coming to him. In other words, if what he was doing is saying, like one way you could respond, and might have been about to respond, I don't know, to what I said is, well, yeah, nobody can respond to the Father unless they draw him, but he draws everybody. And the problem is, no, Jesus is here implying that the people that are rejecting him here haven't been drawn. And that's his point. You can't come to me, he's saying to them, because the Father hasn't drawn you. So I'd be interested in your take on John 6:44, that apparently the Father has not drawn some people and they can't come to him. And secondly, how do you understand Romans 3:11, in which Paul says nobody seeks God?
And for both of them, you did John 6, what?
John 6, verse 44.
Okay. So both of them, I would say that what Paul's talking about is just, again, total depravity, as in just people will, like, that's how it's natural to go towards darkness. So what he's saying is that if God was not seeking after everybody would be on their way to hell. Like there's just so I think that, yeah, that's talking about just the nature of man. But God is stepping in there to try to get them to wake up, respond, so that they will seek him.
And so Paul's statement, there is none that seeketh after God, is not entirely true.
It's true to the fact that God is drawing. It's true to everybody, yes, but God is drawing everybody, trying to get them to start seeking.
So you're saying, tell me if this is a fair, albeit somewhat, I'm intentionally being a little bit humorous here, I guess, but you're saying Paul is saying nobody seeks God until God seeks them, and then some of them seek him.
Actually, yeah, that would be a good way. Right, but really, what it's just talking about is that the nature of man is
right. The nature of man is such that they don't seek after God.
If they were left to their own, everyone would choose darkness.
Right. So there is none that seeketh after God, but then God seeks after everybody, and then some people seek after God, even though Paul doesn't say that here.
Well, correct, yeah.
All right, okay, so I understand that. So now what about John 6:44, where Jesus is explaining why people aren't coming to him, and he says it's because the Father hasn't drawn you?
Well, I have to look at that real quick.
John 6:44.
Right, and he's also saying, and if I get lifted up, then I will draw all men unto myself.
Right, but the problem with that text is, in the context there, what it's talking about is Jesus is not only a savior to Israel. He's a savior to the whole world, meaning Greeks and Japanese and Chinese and so forth. He's a savior to the whole world. So he will draw people from all over the world, not just people from Israel. It's not saying that he draws every single human being, or else it would be this John 6:44 would make no sense.
Right, and I get that God does talk. He speaks. And like they're like, show us a sign. He said, I'm not going to show you a sign except for the sign of Jonas. You know, like
Jonah.
Yeah. Well, he said Jonas, but he was talking about Jonah.
Did he say Jonas?
I believe so. I believe Jonas is Jonah in Greek. How they?
Oh, I got you. I'll look it up while you go on.
Just like Elias is Elijah, or not Elias. Elijah or Isaac, and
yeah, the Greek is Jonas. Yeah,
right.
You're right.
But so the way that God speaks, like, because he also says there's none that doeth good, no, not one, but he also tells us to do good.
Right, he does.
So I get where you're coming from, but I don't think that this passage necessarily, like, just because, like, I don't think he's saying I'm not drawing you. I don't see that in here.
Okay.
I can understand how you can extrapolate it out of it, but I don't see it myself.
Well, just okay. So do this. Between now and the next time we reconvene to discuss this, go back and read John 6 in its context, because what happened a few verses earlier is Jesus has just called himself the bread of life, and the Jews murmur. They whisper about him, and they're sort of mocking him. Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he saith, I come down from heaven? They're saying how foolish it is what this Jesus is saying. So the people that he's talking to here are not coming to Jesus. They're not believing upon Jesus. And his answer to them not coming to him is, no one can come to me unless the Father has drawn them. So what's being implied there is that these people who are refusing to come to him are refusing to come to him because they haven't been drawn. That's the point that Jesus is making here. At least it seems to me that that's what he's doing.
Right. I will look over, because I get it. This is where, they couldn't take what he was saying. Many of his disciples walked away. So I know the story. It's funny that that's John 6:66, as many of his disciples turned and walked with him no more. But I would definitely look over this context. But on this matter, the fact that faith is actually a work of God. Now, we agree on that. But I guess you said you're different than most on this, because.
Well, I misunderstood you. See, when I said I'm different from a lot of Calvinists, I'm talking about Calvinists who say faith is a work in the sense that obedience is a work, meaning a deed, a saving deed. Calvinists, a lot of Calvinists will say that what Jesus means in that passage I was talking about is faith is the kind of work apart from which we're saved. But I'm saying, no, that's not the case. That's not what Jesus is saying there. However, I wholly agree with my fellow Calvinists, and at least to some extent with you, that when a person believes, their belief is a gift of God. They didn't drum up that belief on their own, and we Calvinists would agree. Mm-hmm.
Right, because this goes to the fact of I believe in eternal security, but I don't believe in this just mental assent, make this decision, this choice, and then all of a sudden you're eternally secure. That's partly why we preach the doubtless gospel here, because somebody who knows Jesus Christ personally, knows what he's finished on the cross was sufficient, and has truly rested in it, and again, has a relationship with him, knows him personally, they're not going to walk away. It's just that this goes to the P in tulip. So there's a lot of things that I see in scripture that's absolutely right there. Now, I would maybe describe it a little different than Calvinism, but the truth is there. But limited atonement, that will be the one that we focus on next time, because that one, I'm a little worried, and I can't wait till we talk next time. I'm a little worried that limited atonement makes it a different gospel, and I want you to show me how it's not, because I love you to death. I'm at the same place where you are. You have friends that you don't want to say that that's heresy, because it may not be, and you don't want to offend, but if it is, you want them to know, because you want so I think that discussion will be beneficial for not just me and you, but many people, because that limited atonement is such a pivotal point.
Yeah, very good word. Yes.
So I think you just let me know which Friday is best for you. You look in your schedule, let me know, and we'll go ahead and put it in the schedule. So in the next week, couple months, just let me know.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. I always enjoy talking with you.
Right, it's always a blast. And then also, guys, we are trying to keep the Talkin Doctrine group up and running now. I just haven't had time, and people are helping out there. Chris has actually been a member of the group since we actually got it started. So tonight's broadcast is posted in there, and he's tagged in it. So if anybody wants to talk to Chris about what we were talking tonight, he is always game to engage people.
Well,
Well,
within reason. I have a lot of responsibilities, but
right.
I'll do my best.
Right. Well, I was just meaning you give everyone such a respectful answer.
That's right.
And so, yeah, you might have to wait a little bit, but when he can get to it, he will definitely take your question with sincerity and respond with an answer that you might not necessarily agree with, but at least you'll know where he's coming from and the biblical reasons why.
Absolutely.
And so if you guys, and then also if you can't find him and you know me on Facebook, we're friends. So just look us up on the friends thing. So that's a quick way to get there too.
Yep.
Is there anything you want to close with?
No, just like I said, I always enjoy talking to you. I appreciate the friendly nature and respectful nature of the discussion. And, I do encourage listeners to check out rethinkinghell.com and my Amazon author page and stuff. There's a lot of resources there. But just remember, you don't have to be a Calvinist to take our view of hell. It's just I happen to be a Calvinist who believes in it. So, but yeah, I would love it if people would pick up a copy of my book, though. So I will close with that. Just please do get your hands on a copy of the book. It's not expensive, and I think there's a Kindle edition as well. And I'd love to know what people think. So please do reach out.
Right, guys. On Amazon, like I said, if you just copy and paste the link that's in the description already, it'll bring you right to it on Amazon. It's like $7 for the Kindle. I'm poor, that's what I got. But it's only $14 for the paperback. So it's very inexpensive. I actually opted to not, like, I started to read, but I want to be more engaged with you. And I didn't want, like, I love that you shared from your book with me, but I didn't want to come in with any preconceived note. Oh, he thinks this. Oh, he thinks that. I really wanted to be a little more personal with it. But now I plan on reading all the way through it. But I don't ever prepare for broadcasts, like I just go on how the Lord leads. So I figured if I dove into it too much, it might taint our conversation. I didn't want it to do that. But
well, I appreciate that.
But I will definitely be reading it. And if your writing is any good as your explaining in speech,
I hope it's better.
Well, then it'll be excellent. So again, Chris, I greatly appreciate you. Viewers, also just pay attention. In the next few weeks or so, we'll have another discussion focused on limited atonement. And I hope that it was edifying, and I hope you learned a lot. I hope if there were things you didn't know about Calvinism or about my strange beliefs and how they differed from Christendom, I hope you learned a lot and that you're edified by it. But most importantly, I hope tonight's conversation has encouraged every one of you guys to get in the Word and to just make that a daily discipline. Just make it important to commune with Father in His Word, and He'll straighten all this stuff out. I learn new things every day, and I pray that conversations like these will help encourage others to get in the Word. So thank you again, Chris.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And we will see you guys later. Take care. God bless, and good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.